Greetings and felicitations.
Hip hip hurrah, tally ho.
How you doing, cutie pie?
Hey, Puddin'.
On this episode of StarPodTrek, we discuss the original series classic, Miri.
Blah, blah, blah. Miri will become a woman soon. Miri will contract the disease. Miri is 300 years older than you and me.
The original air date was October 27th, 1966, and it was written by Adrian Speece. Here's the episode summary from Starlog. Anyone over the age of puberty on this Earth-like planet falls victim to a fatal leprous disease, but the children age so slowly, they're around 300 years old, that they don't know why there are no longer any grown-ups, grups, and why occasionally their older members contract the disease and die. They take perpetual childhood for granted. The Enterprise officers land and contract the disease and must find corrective and immunization measures, but the kids distrust them and sabotage their experiments. Kirk tries to win them over through a young girl, Miri, who, entering puberty and contracting the disease, has a crush on the captain.
Alright, this episode, to tell you the truth, the only thing that I really like about it is pure nostalgia. This is one of the ones I would watch when I was younger with my brother and my friend Dave, and we would wrestle together either while we're watching it or, goof around like kids do. And Dave would say, bonk, bonk on the head. And then,
Yeah,
it was more the gibberish talk that I finally remember than anything else.
Well, the bonk bonk was actually something that Gene told the writer Adrian Speece that he needed to come up with a language for these kids, because they would have probably developed their own words over the years.
Okay, so what's the background of Adrian Speece? Because this is the only Star Trek episode where he gets credit for.
When I tried to look him up, it does say that he was a well-known writer of that time. His last name is pronounced Speece, even though it's spelled S-P-I-E-S. He had written for Dick Powell Theater, Climax, and Studio One. Those are some TV shows, and he had been a writer for the New York Mirror.
Okay, so no science fiction background, because we know that Gene Roddenberry preferred to have those with a science fiction background. So we're deviating a little bit from the formula that's been proving to be very good so far. Either someone who really loves science fiction and wants to get involved in science fiction, or someone who has a history of sci-fi. This guy, it just doesn't work for me, this episode.
It isn't really one of my favorites, but it's not, one that I hate.
That's what I'm saying. I'm neutral
Yeah.
with it. There are points that drag out. There are points that don't make sense. We'll talk about it a little bit later, but it makes way more sense with the James Blish adaptation.
So, the idea of children who don't age, or age very slowly, or let's say it's the idea of children without adults, really, because the adults die very quickly. So it's sort of a Lord of the Flies episode. How would children survive without adults?
And they've had 300 years worth of canned food, but they're down to their last 6 months worth now. Was it 6 months, 3 months, something like that?
Yes, and it is strange because it doesn't look like they know how to farm or anything. And it was stated that all the animals died, so they're not eating any meat, but it doesn't, you don't see them eat. We don't know what they have to eat.
And they have a parallel Earth. And it's not a Earth-like planet. It is a parallel Earth. You look at it and you see North America. You see Africa. When you see the planet, you just say, okay, are they going to explain what this parallel Earth is? And they don't. Spock says, oh, it's Earth of 1960. And they're on the Andy Griffith set. And that's kind of a neat little Easter egg. Andy Griffith debuted in 1960. So, there are certain things there that were, as far as the story goes, as far as the setting goes, it wasn't up to par. This is someone who doesn't appreciate sci-fi that just was cobbling something together. That's how I feel watching it. Not even knowing the writer's background, that he had no connection to sci-fi, but it felt that way.
The idea of making it a parallel Earth, they were going to use that somehow in the story, but it got dropped. So, but yeah, it looks strange when you're watching it because they say right at the beginning, I mean, it looked just like Earth. You could see the planet had something, a continent exactly like North America, but it was dropped. And so that's not even relevant to the story at all. And it's not explained.
That's the point.
Yes.
Well, the good thing is, with the Star Trek books, one of the
Department of Temporal Investigations.
That's what it was. Department of Temporal Investigations explained what it was. So I do like it when the Star Trek books try to make the series make more sense.
Yes, the book said it was from a parallel universe. I mean, that's something, at least they, and that's good that the books can pick up on these things. The writers pick up and try to explain these things, even when they don't have to, but it's something neat that they can throw in.
And one more reason why I keep pushing, get the current Star Trek writers to write for current Star Trek. That is, novel writers. Hire them all. Get rid of the Discovery staff there and put in David Mack. Put in Keith DeCandido. Put in
Dayton Ward and David R.R. George.
All of them.
Peter David. All of them, yes.
Peter David's been blackballed for decades. We're never going to see him in Star Trek. But, it just reinforces how awesome it is to read Star Trek books along with or even after the series, because they try to make more sense of it. They have that connective tissue. But this was an era that they were still creating the Star Trek universe. So I'm not going to be so hard on them. It's just this episode just didn't work as much for me. I think there were some curiosities about it. One of the things that I liked seeing was this is the only time from what I recall that we see Kirk and McCoy unzip their tops. And so you see the flap open, which even that design is kind of strange, having a zipper on the shoulder.
That was really odd, and so now we know that, like from this episode was the only time we know that their uniforms have that zipper right at the collar, but it's in a very unusual place. So this was also the only time that Janice Rand got to leave the ship, and it was the last episode with her too.
Yes, and I think she played a great part. It was she was pivotal in this in many ways.
Well, first of all, it doesn't make sense why they would choose her for the landing party. But then once she is there, I mean, you would think she would be helpful as being a woman, that she might be able to talk to the children more easily. But then it turned out that Miri had the crush on Kirk, so.
Okay, that whole thing was very weird, because I thought the same thing, like, okay, just pass this girl off to Janice Rand, and instead, the whole time is like, here, just do some odd errands, kid. Go sharpen some pencils, dude. Like, it was so bizarre.
Well, I think they were trying to keep her occupied while they were working on a cure.
That's what it was. Yeah.
No, but what was weird was the way Kirk was flirting with her.
I was trying not to think that he was doing that. I was trying to think that maybe he was trying to be more fatherly. It was weird.
It was.
What was your take on it?
Well, I mean, he was acting. Of course, he was using her, even though he. It's not that his intentions were that bad. I mean, he needed to get the information, right?
Yes.
But he was coming on to her in a light way, I would think. I mean, he was being gentle. I don't think he talked to her the same way he would talk to a grown woman. But the fact that she was a teenager or in a teenager's body, and he was talking to her in a way that was very flirtatious and seductive, and because she reacted to it in that way.
It was bizarre, and I think that would have been a perfect time to say, okay, Lieutenant Rand, here, try and get some information out of her. I think that could have been Janice Rand's time to shine on the show.
Yeah, they could have used Janice for something other than look at my legs and then having her be the one that got kidnapped and wrapped and tied up.
Yeah. There were parts of it that I just thought that were just so odd. Some things were so disconnected. Just didn't make sense. What do you think about using the cast's children for all the kids? A lot of casts were used except Leonard Nimoy's. Leonard Nimoy did not want his kids there.
Right. Leonard Nimoy said he didn't want his kids to be in show business, basically. But then, his son grew up to be a director. Mm-hmm. But, it was great seeing the kids. I mean, and of course I didn't know that when I was watching this show back in the 70s, but yeah, now to know that, a lot of the cast's, kids were in this episode makes it a great reason to watch it, just to see who you can spot in it and know who was whose kid.
Especially Philip Morris's kids, his daughter and his son. And his son ended up being in Star Trek years later.
Yes, Philip Morris, the boy that was in this, grew up to be on Star Trek later and became famous on Seinfeld.
Mm-hmm. Because Star Trek and Mission Impossible were being filmed near each other.
Yes. And
the little girl that Kirk held up at the end, that was his daughter.
Yeah, actually, and two of his daughters were in this, Leslie and Elizabeth, and he does have a third daughter. I'm not sure, maybe she wasn't born at this time, but his daughter Melanie, that wasn't in this, is the one that grew up to be in Star Trek 5. So she got to be on Star Trek as well.
And Janice Rand's, Grace Lee Whitney, her kids ended up being in Star Trek the Motion Picture.
Yes, and in this.
Yes. So we see a lot of parallels of kids that were in this episode that went on to further Star Trek projects.
And Gene Roddenberry's two daughters were in this.
That's right. And what about Michael J. Pollard? He was 27 years old at the time.
Hard to believe that he was that old playing he was supposed to be 14. Both his character, John, and Miri were supposed to be 14 in this. And Kim Darby, who played Miri, was also, I think she was 19. Mm-hmm. She was much older too.
Yes. I mean, he looked definitely older though. His was the most obvious.
You thought he looked it.
I think he looked way older than a teenager, yes.
But it is interesting that both of them became famous after this episode. They were two unknowns at the time.
That's right.
And,
mm-hmm.
Yeah,
they went on to further movies.
Yeah, Kim Darby did. Well, what she became famous for was True Grit, that mm-hmm. movie, and then Michael J. Pollard was in Bonnie and Clyde.
Mm-hmm. Now, what about the fact that this episode was not able to air for decades in the UK? They found it disturbing.
Yeah, that's interesting, too. The UK picked, and it was only about 4 or 5 episodes that they decided not to air when Star Trek First was shown over there. And so this was one of the episodes that they felt was too disturbing. It must have had to do with the blotches, the disease, when you can see it on the skin, and it just looked really horrible. And that was actually something that William Shatner's daughters said, too. And the thing is, they were so young, because they talked about this like they didn't even realize at first that it was pretend. But then once they did, then they could go along with it.
Yes, they had quite a bit of prodding to attack their father and play the part.
Yes, and just being grossed out by the disease, the splotches on his skin. And Grace Lee Whitney said this is her favorite episode just because her kids were in it.
And didn't Leonard Nimoy say this was his favorite episode too?
Did he?
Or at least one of them? I believe so. Well, it's one of those things I remember there was an interview somewhere that Gene Roddenberry said his favorite episode was The Empath. And I just shake my head when I hear some of the actors and writers and just why? Just why? Like this one, I could see because she saw her kids in it. But that's the only reason I think she would say it's her favorite episode. I think that what we noticed right off the bat is that Scotty's not in it, Sulu's not in it, Uhura's not in it. I mean, you had quite a bit of your mainstays missing all at once out of this episode.
That's true. That's what I noticed too, because Uhura wasn't in it, but they had the other person, Farrell, sitting at communications
with a command shirt on.
Yeah, with the yellow. Mm-hmm. And when they were down on the planet and communicating with the Enterprise, they would be talking to Farrell at communications.
Yes.
They didn't show them talking to whoever was sitting in the command chair. We don't know who was in command at this time. It was probably Scotty. They just didn't show him.
Mm-hmm. It begs to wonder who was in the command chair. It was never addressed.
And Farrell, I know that this probably doesn't sound good, but looking at his face, for some reason I thought he was the character they might have modeled, RX after.
I remember you saying that. You know what I gotta say about that?
What?
Blah, blah, blah.
Oh, I know. Well, the language, yeah, since you mentioned it, the language they made up for the kids was good too.
So
The
memorable.
Grups and
Yes.
onlys and foolies. Yeah, those were neat words, and it does sound realistic that the kids would use those words.
My whole life I've been using these phrases. Blah, blah, blah. Bonk, bonk on the head. And what do you think about the mishmash clothing that the kids were wearing?
It made sense because they could just put on whatever they wanted to. I mean, you know, like...
I read somewhere that it was supposed to look like that over the years they just picked pieces off of different stores and put it together. They had no supervision of anything coordinating, so that's how kids would put their outfits together.
Right. Whatever just looks neat to them, whatever top and whatever pants, you know,
Whatever
they can
mask.
put on. Yeah, and their masks too. I mean, yeah, because I mean, I grew up with a mother who didn't want me to wear things that didn't match. I mean, so she really cared. So now with kids that don't have adult supervision, they just wear whatever. And they were also dirty, like maybe there was no running water or something, but you could always see dirt on their faces.
Mm-hmm.
And I know they were supposed to look like they had just been scrounging around and like, cause they did say it on the show, like mice. They were just running around and creating havoc.
What do you think about the fact that this is the first episode produced by Gene Coon?
Yeah, that was interesting too. I mean, because there were a few good episodes before this, and then you realize, so this was the first one with him. I guess he had to have this as his starter episode, and then he became probably a greater influence after this.
And if we look at the background, we notice that Fields, who was played by John Arnott, he was in quite a few Star Trek episodes, and he got named Fields in Balance of Terror. So I like to see, like, Lieutenant Leslie, he was a semi-regular. Now we have Lieutenant Fields. More and more of these background characters, if we keep rewatching it, we're noticing that sometimes they stay within the department and sometimes they change departments.
Yeah, sometimes one actor that's an extra is wearing a red shirt one time and a yellow shirt the next time. So this one did have 2 security guards that beamed down with them. They were red shirts. Right, they didn't get killed. So, I mean, that's something different. They were there and survived the whole thing.
All right, so as we wrap up our discussion of this episode, I mean, it's obvious neither of us really liked it. There were some curiosities about it, but we always have to ask, how does this fit into the rest of the Star Trek canon, or does it even affect the rest of the canon?
I think it shows how good our crew is at analyzing a disease. You know, McCoy probably did the most of the work, but analyzing and being able to find a cure, and how quickly, you know, on Star Trek they have to find a cure within the hour during the episode. So it kind of set the precedent for that.
And I think it reinforces McCoy being self-sacrificing. We see that on numerous occasions in Trek. He wanted to be the first one to see if it works.
He gave it to himself first. Of course, now there was the Naked Time too, where he found a cure. So that one and this one that we're up to so far.
That's right. But as far as it being connected to the rest of the Star Trek universe, nowhere else on screen has this been spoken of, this incident.
No, it hasn't. And the thing is, they left it open where there could have been a sequel, because they said they left some people there with the children, and that Starfleet would still be sending more people there to help raise the kids.
Now see, this would have been an excellent follow-up, is what happened when the medical team took care of these children? Whatever happened to these children? Did they ever do anything else? What's their story?
And we would think that that once they were probably given the cure so that they would start aging normally, and they would be given an education.
How would they acclimate to possibly going back to our Earth?
I mean, to adults being around. And maybe they were taken off the planet. There probably wasn't any need for them to stay there.
Something that's never been addressed.
And they could have been, they were orphans, so maybe they were sent to be adopted by other families. I mean, that would have been neat.
All right, let's talk about the adaptation by James Blish. This is an example of why we need to read the adaptations along with watching the show, because the adaptation, I think, clarifies things more, and it makes the episode make sense more. What did you think?
I know it was different. Like the book didn't have as, like they cut out all the scenes that had the children, like just the children. They cut out all of those scenes because the Blish adaptation always has things cut out.
Well, the Blish adaptations trim the fat.
Yeah, they do. It's much shorter than the episode. One thing was, Blish mentioned there was a political disaster on Earth called the Cold Peace. That is something from another Blish novel. He threw in one of the things that he created into a Star Trek book.
I didn't realize that. That's kind of neat.
So the visual of watching it on TV was the best way to see the splotches on their skin. And it's harder to explain that in a book to make it as horrible.
But in the book, they made it more horrible because it was already overtaking their body. Very similar to the ones that died in the show. Do you remember when it described McCoy's arm? His entire arm had already been discolored.
It's
so it was
spread
far
a lot
more
faster.
severe.
Yes.
And also what I loved about it right at the beginning is that it gave an explanation for the parallel Earth.
Well, they said it was an Earth colony, right?
Yes. James Blish gave a backstory about this colony and how it was the fourth planet orbiting a different star than Sol. But he called it Earth-like, and having one large and two smaller continents connected by islands. So I think that is a big difference. Is we can understand an Earth-like planet, a Class M planet, but to make it look exactly like Earth, it's less believable.
That's still harder to believe. But yeah, at least that explains why, the people were humans.
Yes.
I mean, that's one thing about Star Trek. They find a lot of humans on other planets and don't really explain it. Well, it's that they do try to explain it later by the preservers, but
you were saying about the Cold Peace, he said that this is the closest planet outside of our solar system. So that is why they had colonists go there. And so he gave a unique backstory as to how these pioneers got there years ago or centuries ago and how it fell apart. And all they had to do is do some tweaks in the episode to make it a little bit more believable. And I think that is, as an adult watching this compared to as a kid watching it, within the first minute or two of the episode, I'm saying, okay, you have a parallel planet, but there's no explanation. And it never gets addressed later on after that. Whereas I think the adaptation did a better job here.
So Blish had that right at the beginning of the story.
And also James Blish spent more time explaining the madness and how it had affected the frustration levels of the crew members, which was a key element of them not being able to communicate or focus.
The idea of getting more irritable, and the way Janice ran when she dropped the beaker and then started screaming and ran out.
And that's because when we walk away from this episode, for the most part, we think about it as the episode where they had the physical virus. But his adaptation focused in a lot on the mental aspects of it. So, again, I'm glad we read along the adaptations with the aired episode so we get a little bit more of a balanced picture.
Thanks for listening. Make sure you hit that subscribe button and join our Facebook group. Live long, and may the Force be with you. Nanu Nanu.